Hey everyone, before we get started on this video, real quick, I would like to do some shameless shilling, but not for me, for Zuki, my family cat. He's recently been very sick, and he's been in the hospital at the time of making this video for over a week, and it's looking like his medical bills are going to end up being more than we anticipated, and it's already been a fair amount. So if anybody is able to help out and they'd like to make a donation, there are going to be links to my Patreon and Ko-fi in the description, and I'll make sure that everything goes towards helping to pay for Zuki's medical bills. I already mentioned this on my stream, and already you guys have been unbelievably generous, so thank you so much for that from me and my family. But I figured a lot of my fans don't watch the stream, so I should mention here real quick. But now with that out of the way, on to the video. So, Spark the Electric Jester 3, yeah, really fun game, and back when it first came out, there was quite a bit of hubbub around this game. People really excited by it, people really digging it, and that's really cool, but at the same time, all I ever hear is people talking about Spark the Electric Jester 3. People asking me, Pariah, when are you gonna make a video of Spark 3? When are you gonna play it and cover it and talk about it? Spark 3, Spark 3, Spark 3! And I'm like, you know, based on the title of Spark the Electric Jester 3, we can surmise that there's probably a Spark the Electric Jesters 1 and 2 as well that are probably also worth talking about. And as someone that's been a fan of the Spark the Electric Jester games since the original first came out, I find the fact that 3 overshadows the rest of the series a little saddening. And even more than that, I feel that the creator of the Spark the Electric Jester games, Lake Feperd, does not get as much credit as he deserves. Like I said, people talk about, oh, he made Spark 3, but he's done a lot more than that. Besides the Spark the Electric Jester games, he's also made 3 complete Sonic fan games, which is crazy. Very few people have ever even finished 1. So in this video, we are going to talk about Spark 3, as well as the Spark the Electric Jester series in general, but first I want to briefly talk about the other things that Lake Feperd has done. Starting with his Sonic fan games, and like I said, he's made 3 of these things, and one of his bigger claims to fame back in the day was with his first Sonic fan game, Sonic Before the Sequel, a game that's supposed to take place between Sonics 1 and 2, as this was one of the first ever Sonic fan games to see completion. Not the first, but one of the first, and in my opinion, this was easily the best Sonic fan game that existed at the time. However, now, looking at a game like Sonic Before the Sequel, I could very easily imagine some fans who weren't around for those early days of Sonic fan games looking at a game like this and thinking it doesn't look very good. The game is undeniably pretty rough and unpolished. There's a number of bugs, some crashing issues that you're going to run into if you try to play something like this. Visually, it's obviously not a game that's going to knock your socks off or anything. A lot of the new original sprites here look pretty bad, but the majority of the sprites are just taken from existing Sonic games. The level design can feel quite strange at times, and of course, the biggest issue with any of these older 2D Sonic fan games, the physics are pretty rough and kinda weird feeling, especially if you're really used to the official 2D Sonic games. You come to something like this and it's like, whoa, it really takes some getting used to. And then when you compare that to some more modern 2D Sonic fan games we have today, like Triple Trouble 16-bit, I could see something like this being very unappealing. But you gotta understand that at the time, all the things that allow for such high-quality, polished 2D Sonic fan games today, all the frameworks, all the knowledge, all the information and tools out there, none of that existed back at this time. This is right around the time when Christian Whitehead was just starting to work with Sega officially on the Retro Engine remakes of the original Sonic games. This was one of the best playing 2D Sonic fan games ever, and more importantly, it paved the way for Lake Feperd making games that would eventually lead to Spark the Electric Jester. But even aside from the historical context of this game, even coming back to the game today, when I have played Mania and Triple Trouble 16-bit and all these newer 2D Sonic fan games, I still come back to games like Before the Sequel and think it's quite a fun 2D Sonic game. Like I said, the physics take some getting used to, but you can get used to them, and they feel okay, good enough that you're like, okay, I'm playing a Sonic game. It doesn't feel amazing, but I am playing a Sonic game. And while yes, the game is very rough, I mean, we're talking about the Sonic franchise here. That's pretty common of the official games, so that's something that any Sonic fan is going to be used to. And once you get past those things, you find that Sonic Before the Sequel is pretty fun. Not a whole lot to report about this game that's especially unique. It's a very traditional, by-the-numbers 2D classic Sonic game. But for me, the thing that really makes it stand out is Lake's level design. Like I said, sometimes the level design can get a bit weird, but Lake definitely has a unique style to his level design, especially in his 2D games. You can feel it a lot, and it's a style that I really do like. I enjoy it quite a bit. And you can see the evolution of it when you play all of Lake's games, how he gets better and evolves his level design style from this to then the next couple Sonic fan games and then to Spark the Electric Jester 1. It's hard to describe in words, but I would say with his level design, Lake is good at playing around with the aspects of his games in unique, creative, and fun ways that make for cool little platforming challenges. So I would say that Before the Sequel is worth giving a look if you have some decently high tolerance for games that are very rough and unpolished. This is the guy's first game, after all, and he's literally learning how to make games while he was making this. So I wouldn't blame anyone for finding this game to be too rough to be worth your time, but I would still say it's at least worth trying. However, its follow-up, Sonic After the Sequel, this is a game that I absolutely think you should play if you're a fan of 2D Sonic games. It's basically the same thing as Before the Sequel, just a very traditional, by-the-books 2D classic Sonic game, but it's way better in every single regard. Way better level design, way better physics and controls and game feel, way better visuals, most of it actually being custom artwork this time. And the music, bro, my god, it's so good. If you have not played After the Sequel, I highly recommend doing that just to listen to all the amazing music. And honestly, that's kind of all I really have to say about the game. Like I said, it's just a very simple, traditional 2D classic Sonic game, and it's just really good. Even to this day, with much nicer and more polished and more well-made 2D classic Sonic fan games, this is still one of my favorites. And as I said, one of the things I like about playing these games is to see Lake grow as a creator and see the evolution of his games and how it eventually turns into Spark the Electric Jester. Because you start to see the beginnings of the kinds of things he likes to do start to crop up in this game pretty blatantly. Also, this is in this game, so, I mean, there you go. There's the earliest prototype version of Spark the Electric Jester right there. It's Sonic wearing the Kirby hat. And I guess while we're talking about these games, it's worth talking about how they were made, because like I said, this was before the time of all of our modern 2D Sonic fan game frameworks that exist nowadays that people can use to make Sonic fan games out of. But these Sonic fan games were actually made in one of the earliest one of these Sonic fan game frameworks called Sonic Worlds. And it was one of the earliest public tools for making 2D Sonic fan games that the community had. Many Sonic fan games were made in this engine, not many of which saw completion, but some of them did, like Sonic Axiom way back in the day. But also, there is another game that is quite notable that was made in Sonic Worlds. Freedom Planet. The original version of the first Freedom Planet game was made using Sonic Worlds. And as you can imagine, this being the framework that Lake used for his Sonic fan games, as well as Spark the Electric Jester, he was involved in the development of this framework, and in fact would even go on to make his own forks of this framework that are more simple and straightforward for less experienced developers. So in a way, we can partially thank Lake Feperd for the existence of Freedom Planet. Oh hey, look who it is. So that's it for your traditional 2D Sonic fan games, but we got one more to cover here that is quite different, and definitely the most interesting game out of the fan games in this bundle. Sonic Chrono Adventure, which is kind of a little more of a contentious fan game because it is so different and experimental. This is a Metroidvania. And yeah, this game is in 4x3, because actually all these games were originally in 4x3, but for before and after the sequel, I was playing those with fan-made enhanced versions, because those fan games are so good that other fans make their own enhanced versions of them, just like official Sonic games. Pretty cool. But no one's done that yet for Chrono Adventure, so we gotta go with the OG version here. And this game, let me tell ya, it makes a pretty bad first impression, because there's a lot of weird stuff in this game, and a lot of things that don't really work super well at first, and it's very off-putting. At least it was for me when I first tried this game. I actually just recently beat this game for the first time, because after a while, it starts to warm up to you, and it kind of makes sense. But it takes some work to get there, because, like, this is one of those Metroidvanias in more of like a Super Metroid style, where they give you, like, very little direction as to where to go, especially beginning off. And sometimes that can work pretty well for certain Metroidvanias, but sometimes it can also lead to, like, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm just kind of going because I can go, and I'm hoping that eventually I'm gonna stumble upon progression. And that, to me, can sometimes get in the territory of feeling frustrating. And you do get a little bit of that here in Chrono Adventure, especially at the beginning, but over time the game starts to smooth out and you start to get a better grasp of where you're supposed to go next. That is, if you can decipher the game's very confusing map system. This game's real ambitious with what it's trying to do here. Instead of just having a giant 2D map that you navigate, it has this, like, looping map structure, and the camera, like, spins around when you, like, make turns, so you're going, like, north and south, or east and west, and left and right changes which direction is which, depending on where you are and which way the camera's facing, and it stays confusing the entire time you're playing the game. I mean, you just look at that map, and I'm like, I don't know where to go. And I feel like maybe this was not the best idea. Another thing about this game that I found off-putting was it has quite a bit of story emphasis, actually. There's a number of cutscenes here with, like, text dialogue for all the characters, and it really got in the way of the pacing, especially early on in the game, and a lot of it I felt was just like, I don't care, can I just play a video game? I'm not interested in your bad fanfiction. And then there's also the kinda strange power system in this game, because the way it achieves its Metroidvania progression is by giving Sonic a number of, like, Sonic Adventure-esque power-ups that give him different moves. But it's not just, like, extra abilities, it's, like, different move sets, and you can swap between them on the fly, and each one lets you do different things. Like, the first one you get is a sword, and I'm like, okay, that's really weird and un-Sonic that now I'm no longer rolling in a ball and just jumping on enemies. I'm standing still and doing sword slashes at them. Don't know how I feel about that, but again, this whole power stuff and the melee combat, you just see the early vision for Spark the Electric Jester forming here. The ring system in this game is also a little bit weird because it functions like more traditional health. You have 3 hit points, and every 10 rings refills one of those hit points, so once you hit 30, you max out, which means as you're running through these levels, there's just a bunch of rings all over the place that you just can't collect, and there's a lot of just stuff like that in this game that feels very weird and very un-Sonic, and you're like, I just want to play a Sonic game. But I stuck with the game, played it more, and eventually it starts to all kinda come together and starts to get kinda cool. Because while this game is a Metroidvania, it does still kinda try to have traditional Sonic level design in here, by way of kinda taking like a Zelda approach to it. There's kind of a separation between the overworld and the quote-unquote levels of the game. With the overworld, you're traveling on that confusing map, but at each of the key points is some kind of landmark, either a city with a town with NPCs and like shops, or it'll be one of the levels you can go to. But then between those major locations are kind of these transition areas that is like a level that's designed to facilitate both going left and right in them, and within that they have kind of traditional multi-tiered Sonic level design, so it's like taking the road from this location to that location, and that's kind of its own sort of Sonic level. And then you go into one of these major locations, like a dungeon or whatever, and that's more of like an actual full-on beginning-to-end level that you play through. And once I got a feel for the structure here, I was like, okay, I'm starting to feel this a little bit. It does feel like this weird, sprawling Metroidvania that's like confusing, But at the end of the day, most of the gameplay does feel like you're just playing through traditional Sonic levels, and that part of it works really well. The level design here is just as good as the kind of stuff that you see in Sonic after the sequel, maybe even a little bit better. There's a lot of really creative, unique, cool gimmicks in pretty much every level here that I really like. And the Metroidvania powers you get start to get really neat. The first one, the sword, that one's pretty lame. You just use it for fighting enemies, but generally I avoided it when I could. But then you get like these air dash shoes that you can charge up and then launch yourself around, and that's pretty cool. And one of the power-ups you get is just straight up the boost, so this partway transforms into a boost Sonic game. And you know, as someone that loves me my classic physics-based Sonic, you might think I wouldn't like that, but it actually totally works as like a sense of progression in a Metroidvania, because undeniably the boost makes you way more powerful, and it does end up feeling like that. You can traverse the overworld and get from place to place much more quickly once you get the boost. And really, if you want to get around quickly, then you start swapping between your different powers and using them for different situations, and it's cool. Boss fights here also start to get more elaborate than the kinds of bosses you find in more traditional Sonic games, and again, start to get closer to the kinds of bosses we see in the Spark the Electric Jester games, especially the final boss is just so Lake Feperd is crazy. So yeah, I was very surprised and impressed with Chrono Adventure, the one Lake Feperd game that I didn't really like when I tried to play it in the past. But now it might actually be my favorite of his Sonic fan games, in a sea of 2D classic Sonic fan games that are just basically Sonic 3 and Knuckles again. Here, finally, is a game that's really daring to try new things with the 2D Sonic formula, and there's some roughness, there's some weirdness, there's some odd choices here and there, but overall, I think this game is really fun and one of the most interesting Sonic fan games out there. So definitely one for the open-minded. It's a very cool game, and I honestly would love to see Lake revisit this kind of Metroidvania structure. Maybe a future Spark game, that would be cool? I don't know, we'll see, but let's actually move on to now talking about Spark the Electric Jester proper, shall we? Lake Feperd has graduated from the world of Sonic fan games to now legally distinct Sonic-like games that he can sell for money and make a profit off of, which good for him, because his games are really good and he deserves it. And something I find really interesting about Spark is that for the longest time, there was nothing out there that was really anything like Sonic, except a little bit in the 90s when Sonic ripoffs were around, but those died off pretty quickly. And then it was just Sonic doing those kinds of games, and there was really nowhere else to go to get this kind of experience or this kind of gameplay. And then, all of a sudden, we have Freedom Planet and Spark the Electric Jester both coming out at relatively the same-ish time, and kinda doing the same thing, taking the original 2D classic Sonic formula and evolving it in a number of ways, and mixing it heavily with influences from other games, and adding a heavy combat focus to it. There are a lot of similarities between Spark the Electric Jester and Freedom Planet, which is totally fine by me, because this kind of formula works really well for these kinds of games. Like Freedom Planet, Spark throws away the one-button simplicity of 2D Sonic for something much more intricate and complex, with many of the same design decisions. Examples being doing away with rings and instating a more traditional health system, taking away contact damage from enemies, giving you much more elaborate movesets with many more platforming maneuvers and many more combat abilities, as this game also has a much larger emphasis on combat, with many, many boss fights that are way more involved than anything you find in Sonic. So I don't know, Freedom Planet did come first, so it's very possible that Spark took a number of notes from that game, but hey, it goes both ways, because this game also has a little dash that gives you some invincibility frames, and then Freedom Planet 2 implemented the dodge there, so, you know, what goes around comes around. Point is, by sharing so many similarities with Freedom Planet, this game ends up being very fun in a lot of the same ways as Freedom Planet. You get that good old 2D Sonic formula, but way more fleshed out and complex and interesting than what you find in actual Sonic games, while at the same time you have a greater emphasis on combat and boss fights, and it's actually very good and very fun. The combat here is really cool, and I'll get into that a little bit later. This game is also similar to Freedom Planet, no slouch. It can get fairly difficult at certain points, especially when you move on to the higher difficulties, which I'll also talk about later. It's pretty crazy. I distinctly remember when Freedom Planet first came out being completely blown away by how good that game was, and then the exact same thing happened when I played this game as well, for all of the same reasons. But that's enough talking about what makes this game similar to Freedom Planet. Let's talk about what makes it unique. Or, I guess, unique for Sonic games, because as you might be able to tell from the fact that Spark is just wearing the Kirby hat, there's a lot of Kirby DNA in Spark, almost as much as it has Sonic in there, because this game kind of takes the concept of the elemental shields from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, you know, these power-ups that grant you different abilities, and says, okay, well, what if we took that and made those into Kirby powers that give you way more elaborate, unique, different movesets, and basically every single power-up is its own playable character, and you can have 2 of these power-ups equipped at a time, and you can swap between them on the fly. This is what makes this game really cool, but I can't even go into all the power-ups here and all their movesets, because there's way too many, and they're way too elaborate to go into all of them. But for a few examples, you have, like, the sword here, which gives you a number of melee attacks you can do with the sword, obviously, but you can also charge the attack button and release it to enter this enhanced state where you're way faster and jump way higher for a couple of seconds, and you can do that as much as you want for free. You have the Archer power-up, and you can shoot arrows in any direction, but you can also shoot arrows downward, and they kind of push you up to get longer distance on your jumps, kind of works a bit like a hover. You have the Edgy power-up, one of my favorites, gives you a little quick knife attacks that don't do a whole lot of damage, but you can also like throw out kunais and everything. Coolest thing about this power, though, is that you can just straight up run on walls freely as much as you want. It makes navigating these levels really, really cool. Another one of my favorites is the Wind power-up. Makes your jump super floaty, lets you glide, lets you have infinite air dashes, lets you charge up to then shoot this big air blast that pushes you in the opposite direction, and you can use that for all kinds of cool air maneuverability. You have some powers that are more combat-oriented, like you have this hammer that does really heavy damage, and with a lot of these powers, you also fill up this meter as you attack enemies to get, like, big super attacks, where you can make, like, this volcano that does passive damage to anything in it. You have the Board power-up. Basically, you get on a Sonic Rider's extreme gear, and you get, like, the boost mode from Sonic Advance 2 or 3. If you run fast enough, then you get this extra speed burst, and it's really cool. Yeah, there's a lot of powers in this game, and that's a good portion of the fun in your first playthrough, is just discovering a new power and seeing how it works and what you can do with it, and then experimenting with the levels to see what you can accomplish with that, what kind of cool things you can figure out. Makes for quite a varied playthrough as you're going through things, constantly changing up how you play. It's really awesome, and like I said, you can stock up to 2, so you can swap between your favorites. Usually I like to have one that's combat-oriented for bosses, and then one that's platforming-oriented for rushing through the levels. And yeah, speaking of boss fights, those are really good in this game because we have actual combat mechanics here. You got invincible dodge, you got elaborate movesets, you got real enemy attacks with like telegraphs where they have a little sound effect letting you know like kind of the dodge timing. Very much you can also feel that there's quite a bit of like character action influence in Lake Feperd's games, especially starting with Spark. You know, things like Bayonetta and stuff, you can tell he's really into those kinds of things. And the combat sort of has that kind of feel to it. It's not as fleshed out as something like a Bayonetta, obviously, but there is enough there that makes it quite fun, and like many character action games, this game kind of has a scaling difficulty where once you beat the game, you unlock a higher difficulty, and then you beat that and you get a higher difficulty. And similar to those kinds of character action games, really your first playthrough of Spark the Electric Jester is just the taste test. It's kind of learning the game and getting a feel for it, but it's those later playthroughs that are arguably the real game. After beating the game for the first time, then you unlock a second playthrough as Fark, who is the Metal Sonic of the Spark games, and he doesn't have the Kirby copy powers. He has his one set moveset, but it's quite an interesting moveset, has a lot of cool stuff to it. But one of the main things of Fark's playthrough is that he's only allowed to take 4 hits. He's got less health than when you're doing your first playthrough as Spark, and his dodge has no invincibility frames on it, but instead he has a parry, which actually has many more invincibility frames, so it actually makes combat a little bit easier for him. But that's because it's only there to get you prepared for the third playthrough, Spark's Challenge, which is where the game really shows what it's all about. In Spark's Challenge mode, you play through the game again as Spark, but through Fark's version of the game, meaning you have to fight all those extra harder bosses, but you can only take 2 hits before you die. You're back to using Spark's very short iframe window from his dash, which is a lot harder than Fark's parry. And just getting through the levels here can get extremely intense when you get to some of those late game areas where they are throwing such a ridiculous number of enemies and hazards at you so quickly that, holy shit. Getting through these levels when you only have 2 hits is some of the most intense, crazy gameplay you're ever gonna find in any 2D platformer. And this is why, up to this point, this video has been pretty much just me sucking Lake Feperd's dick, because I think that he makes fantastic games. Every single game that he's made, I've pretty much loved. I think that he's a really, really good game designer. He really knows what makes a game cool, and he just kind of hones in on those things and makes stuff that just makes you go, hell yeah. And the thing that is especially impressive about all this is that Lake makes his games pretty much entirely by himself. He doesn't really have a team. It's all him. The only thing that he doesn't do is the music, but everything else is made just by one person, pretty much. Which, needless to say, is very impressive, especially considering how good these games are, but at the same time, it makes me go like, bruh, calm down. Like, the rate at which he releases games, I'm like, you gotta stop working so hard, guy. You're gonna work yourself to death. Though I will say, as one product of Lake's games pretty much being solo ventures that I'm not in love with, while I do think that Lake is a great game designer, he's definitely not a great artist, and I do think that's quite a problem. I mean, his environment art is really good. I think he's a good environment background artist, but when it comes to character art, I mean, the product speaks for itself, I think. I find that Spark has a really, really weak character design, and the sprites in his games are not super good looking. They're pretty amateurish. And I'm not someone that's gonna get too caught up on the visuals of a game. Like, if a game's a bit ugly, whatever, I don't care as long as it's fun. However, that is not most people. Most people will be very off-put by a game if it doesn't look very good in their eyes, and not that I don't like looking at them, but that these games are really good, and I want them to see the success they deserve, and I imagine a lot of people will probably never give them a try because they look so bad. But hey, if you can look past that, I highly recommend Spark the Electric Jester. If you like 2D Sonic, if you like Freedom Planet, if you like action games, it's a no-brainer. This game is excellent. But now we get to the things that I think are more interesting and exciting. Spark the Electric Jester 2, where the series moves into the 3rd dimension. Ooh. And something that's always been a bit weird to me about both Sparks 2 and 3 is that they're described as being akin to these Sonic Adventure games, but I really don't find that the case at all. These games are actually most similar to the type of 3D Sonic game that we first saw in Sonic Utopia, a more faithful translation of 2D Sonic gameplay into 3D. How on earth could this possibly be a Sonic Adventure type game when you have manual camera control, real platforming design, good physics that aren't broken and enable you to, say, go through loops for realsies without requiring scripting? This isn't really much like Sonic Adventure, if you ask me, outside of, like, superficial things. Really, like I said, it plays more like these kinds of new era of, like, 3D classic Sonic physics-based games, like a Utopia or a GT. But what this game has that none of those other ones have is that this is actually a full game. It's not a demo, it's not a proof of concept of 3 levels. This isn't showing what this type of gameplay could be. This is it, and it's pretty good. However, I'm not going to talk about Spark 2 that much because the game is kind of obsolete thanks to the existence of Spark 3, which is basically the same game but better in every single way. And all of the levels from Spark 2 have been imported into Spark 3, so honestly, I struggle to even say it's worth bothering with Spark 2 anymore. But to give you the Cliff Notes versions of things, it's a fun game, there's a lot of cool stuff in here, however, there are a lot of really bad problems in the balancing and in some of the aspects of the design. The cool power stuff from Spark 1 has been dramatically reduced here. There are way less powers, and they are way less different from each other than they were in the first game. They're almost, like, negligible in what they do, except for, like, one or two. And like many games of this style, there is no air drag here, meaning you can jump massive distances and skip huge chunks of the level design, especially helped by one of the powers and its ability to give you this ridiculously high jump, so you're just barely even playing these levels if you really try to optimize and play well. Pro tip, if you are going to play Spark 2, I recommend just don't use the powers because it makes the game more fun. And the combat is totally ruined in this game, shockingly so. After Spark 1 had such really good combat, you move over to Spark 2 and it's terrible, it's atrocious, it's just button mashing. And because of the systems here, the bosses all die with, like, no effort. They end before they even begin and feel like a total waste of time. So while there is a lot about Spark 2 that I do think is fairly cool, I struggle to really recommend the game because of all these very significant problems. But before we move on to Spark 3, one last thing I want to say about Spark 2 is that during the development of this game, Lake had to create a new framework for making 3D Sonic-type games called Hedge Physics, which he released publicly to the Sonic community. And similar to Sonic Worlds, people have been using that to make Sonic fan games, including Sonic GT. That game's framework is based off of Hedge Physics, and of course that team went on to create Rolling Rascal, so similarly to Freedom Planet, another Sonic-like game that, in a way, owes part of its existence to Lake Feperd. As I said, this guy has contributed a lot of great stuff to the Sonic community, and I think people don't appreciate that enough. But now, it is finally time to talk about the thing everyone's been waiting for, the thing that everyone skipped ahead to this part of the video to see, because this is the only thing they actually cared about. Spark the Electric Jester 3. And just like the first game, I would compare Spark 3 to Freedom Planet, specifically Freedom Planet 2, both games that came out in the same year, as it turns out. And that Freedom Planet 2 is my favorite 2D Sonic game, and Spark 3 may very well be my favorite 3D Sonic game. This game is incredible. Obviously, it's built off the foundation of Spark 2, but everything's so much better here. Controls and game feel way improved. A lot of the mechanical and design problems of Spark 2 have been addressed here. There's air drag now, so you can't just leap massive distances and skip huge swaths of the level design. Though the level design is way, way better here, way more fun, and forces you to do the platforming a lot more, so that's not even nearly as much of an issue anyway. Combat is way better, I'll talk about that later. One thing about this game is it's basically removed the Kirby copy ability stuff pretty much entirely. But I'm okay with that because this game is really honing in on that core, like, Sonic speed action platforming stuff, and doesn't really need the extra powers to do that really well, so I'm okay with it. This game knows what it is and it knows what it's focusing on. So you take all the solid stuff that had potential in Spark 2, fix all its problems, and now you got a really solid foundation to build off of there. But what I really love about Spark 3 is that I like games that are kind of going off the rails and maybe asking a bit too much out of the average player. Games with really, really high skill ceilings that realistically the vast majority of players are never going to touch. Games that are maybe a little too demanding and should probably realistically reel back their design and not have so much craziness going on. Those are the kinds of games that I really love, and Spark 3 is absolutely that kind of game. This game has too many mechanics. It has too many features and too many cool things. And I don't mean that as hyperbole to say, like, yo, this game is not... I literally think this game has too much stuff going on, and it's gonna overwhelm a lot of players. But for me, I friggin' love it. So what are all these crazy mechanics that I'm talking about? Well, to begin with, of course, you got a lot of that Sonic physics stuff, and that's all really cool, but pretty understandable and digestible, especially, obviously, for someone as experienced with Sonic as me. As far as the moveset is concerned, you got a lot of the usual suspects for this kind of game. You got double jumping, you got the dash from the previous games, though no longer with invincibility frames on it. You have the boost function, which is like this game's equivalent to the spin dash, and you can also do it in the air. You have a downward dash, good for quick falling and going into downward slopes. You got wall jumping, and if you hold dash into a wall, then you can wall run. Most of this stuff was already there in Spark 2, but I figured I'd go over it quickly here since I didn't talk about that. And yeah, this game feels really good to play. Also new to Spark 3 is rail grinding, and rail grinding in this game is not just some crappy sidestepping, it's real rail grinding. No balancing like you would find in SA2, but what it has instead is a crouch that kind of acts as the equivalent of rolling in the 2D Sonic game. So when you're going downhill, you crouch, and then when you're going uphill, you can not crouch. But then also you have boosting when you're on rails using the energy meter that you have in the top left under your health. That's used for a lot of your special abilities, including the boost. There's a bit of decision making there about whether or not you want to use your resources to increase speed on an uphill on a rail where you normally would be losing it. And those special abilities is what the bottom left, the D-pad, is for. You get abilities in the shop and you can equip them to the D-pad and they all have different functions. Some speed you up, some give you an explosion to kill enemies, some lower your gravity so you fall slower and can make bigger jumps, some of them heal you, some of them give you a shield. You know, lots of different functions that you can pick and choose what you want to fit what you're aiming for. And of course, this adds a whole element of resource management to this game, because to fill the energy meter, you either have to kill enemies or collect the blue things around the levels, so those are things to actively go out of your way to look for. You also have this projectile attack that you can shoot, and that doesn't impede your movement at all, so you can just kind of shoot that out while you're running past enemies to give yourself some free extra meter when you have opportunities for it, and you can remember that that's an option because there's too many other things bouncing around your head all at once. Also, another way you can build meter is when you're on rails, you can charge and intentionally slow down, converting your speed into meter. So that adds a potentially interesting decision of, do I want to slow down now to give me resources to go faster later? It makes the gameplay here really dense. It's not just platforming your way through things as quickly as possible, and not just even looking at the levels as ways to manipulate the physics to launch yourself more quickly, but on top of that, you're looking for ways to optimize your use of resources as well. And I love this kind of stuff, but I will guarantee you that most players probably barely use any of this. And that's not even everything with this stuff, because another type of ability you can put on the D-pad is other playable characters. There are 4 alternate playable characters that you can equip like abilities, and you can just swap between them freely, and they all have different movesets and different abilities and different platforming properties. So that's another thing to consider, what character is best for handling this situation at any given moment and swapping on the fly. If you can remember to think about that when you're not being distracted by also trying to remember to light speed dash as much as possible, because that's a mechanic in this game. You can do it off all the little things. And in this game, a very cool thing with the light speed dash is it speeds you up no matter how fast you're going. It's additive. And you can go pretty freaking fast in this game because there's no speed cap, so you can just hit trail after trail after trail and go faster and faster, and oh my god, I'm going way too freaking fast. This is awesome. It makes the light speed dash way more fun and cool and interesting than it's ever been in a Sonic game, and gives you another thing to try to route around and incorporate into how you play the levels, looking for any opportunity for good trails of bits that can speed you up even further. But then, of course, you also need to think about the homing attack and routing magnet dashing into how you play, because if you played Frontiers, you might know about the homing boost in that game, where you homing attack into an enemy and then cancel that with the boost, preserving your homing attack speed and launching yourself off ridiculously fast. Spark 3 actually had that mechanic before Frontiers was. Actually, Spark 2 had it as a glitch, but Lake kept it in Spark 3 and turned it into an actual game mechanic. It was a bit overpowered in 2. It's more balanced here in 3, and it's awesome. It's not as powerful as it is in Frontiers. You can't redirect it, and you can't gain height with it. It's just to give you another burst of speed to go even faster. So now you're also looking for enemies and trying to position yourself well to launch yourself off them with even more speed, and then also looking out for light speed dash opportunities and your meter management and using all your powers and making sure you're using the right character for the right situation, and you're trying to shoot enemies as you go, and you're doing all the physics stuff and just the basic platforming and all the movement mechanics. Is too much. It's too much for my brain to handle, and it's great. I don't know if there is any compliment I can give to a game higher than it's too much fun. There are too many ways to do cool shit here. But it's not all just in the moveset. The levels here are also really strong. It has that good old Lake Feperd design ideology to it that I'm a big fan of, and all the levels are really interesting and really cool. But also a thing this game does that's a big step up from Spark 2 is it does a much better job of making these levels feel like places rather than just video game levels. There's a lot stronger theming here of where we are, and then that getting incorporated into the level design and the layouts of the stages. My favorite area in the game, aesthetically, is this one where it starts with you driving on the highway, because there's also vehicle segments in this. I'll talk about those a little more later. And then you get to an airport, and then you're going through the airport, going through like the baggage stuff and boarding planes and everything. It really feels like I'm running through a giant airport. And then after that, you're on a level where you're climbing on all the support structures to get to the top of a rocket ship so you can get inside of it. And then the next level, you're in space, platforming around like an international space station kind of deal, and you got low gravity, and it feels like I'm in frickin' space, you know? Really cool stuff like that. These levels are very densely packed with a lot of decorations and a lot of objects and props that really bring these places to life. These levels can also be ridiculously big, because you can go really fast in this game, and still, these levels can be upwards of 5 minutes long sometimes. The final level is really long. It's like 20 minutes to get through it. Which a level that long could feel like a slog, but it really presents itself as like one ultimate final challenge, kind of like an Eggman Land type of deal, so it works. I think it's really cool. And in general, this game is shockingly long, especially considering what it is. You know, action games generally tend to be on the shorter side, but then this is an indie game made by one person. Yet your first playthrough of this game is gonna be like 6-7 hours long, which is insane for these kinds of games. That's longer than most Sonic games. So this is a full package of a game here. Fantastic gameplay, really great levels, and lots of content to it that I still haven't even covered all of it, because then there's also the combat of Spark 3. And the combat of Spark 2, as I said there, totally borked. The combat in Spark 1, really good, absolutely destroyed in Spark 2. Thankfully, not only has it been totally fixed here in Spark 3, it has been made just as incredible as the platforming gameplay, amazingly. When you're running through these stages, you're playing one of the most in-depth, interesting, complex, and nuanced Sonic games that have ever been made. But when you're fighting with enemies, you're playing a character action game now. One of the things I like about Lake as a designer is I think he has very similar tastes to me, so I think that he took our two favorite genres of game and decided to fuse them together, and for me that's always been my white whale. If someone could do that, take a fast-paced 3D action platformer and mix it with character action gameplay, holy shit, that'd be incredible. But I always imagine that's something that you couldn't really do because those are such different dichotomous types of games with such different gameplay that both are incredibly complex and demanding, that doing both at the same time, how could anyone ever achieve that? Well, here it is. This is no Devil May Cry or Bayonetta. It's not up to that level, nor would I expect it to be, because those are the best of the best and they are dedicated action games, whereas this is just part of what this game is. But considering that, I still find this to be really impressive how much there is to this combat system. It's ultimately fairly simple, and like most character action games, if all you're trying to do is kill the enemies, then it's pretty shallow. But with these kinds of games, just killing the enemy, that's not the point. It's about killing the enemy in cool, creative, stylish ways. That's what really matters. And while you do have a relatively limited moveset here for actual character action standards, you still have plenty to really play around with. You got quite a number of moves with Spark, launchers, air launchers, ways to knock guys away, projectiles to cancel out enemy inertia so you can reset them for more air combos. But then, of course, on top of that, you do have those 4 extra playable characters that you can swap to at any time, and they all have their own combat movesets, much of which do overlap with what you can already do with Spark, but, you know, in slightly different ways and with slightly different nuances depending on the character, and really it just gives you more ways to vary up how you attack the enemies for styling. So I would say there is enough here to allow for some real creative fighting, and that's what really makes these kinds of games cool. Coming up with cool juggles where you're switching characters mid-combo to use all their different abilities to shoot the enemy up and then launch them down and blast them away and chase after them and do another air juggle. It might not be up to the level of a Hi-Fi Rush or a Ninja Gaiden, but it's definitely better than, I mean, the Werehog from Unleashed if you want to compare it to that. But I'd say this is even better than, like, God of War to me. This is really fun. And I'd say the proof is all in the pudding. You've been watching me fight in the game's Bloody Palace mode, and I gotta say, it's quite interesting seeing this game succeed where Sonic has failed with stuff like the Werehog or even Frontiers, trying to mix Sonic game action platforming with character action combat that's never worked out before. But then this game comes in and it totally nails it and makes it work amazingly. There's actually a number of things like that in Spark 3 to me. Like, you have these collectathon levels that show up every now and then, where instead of being a linear obstacle course, instead you have to collect 10 medals that are spread all over the place. And they kind of feel a little bit like SA2 Treasure Hunter kind of levels, or even a little bit like Open Zone, honestly. And I think that these succeed way more than either of those two things. It's way more fun, you got a more interesting moveset here, much more interesting level design that actually makes for, like, a fun playground to physics around in. It works really well. Like, this is the kind of stuff that I would have wanted to see in an open world Sonic game. Like, take this kind of thing and make it the size of Sonic Frontiers, and now we're talking. And another thing this game succeeds at, where Sonic has struggled in the past, is the vehicle stuff. There's 2 vehicles in this game, a hovercraft and a truck. The hovercraft isn't too great. You can fly around and shoot a lot of projectiles and, like, dodge missiles and stuff, but it's okay, and it doesn't last for too long, so it doesn't really get in the way that much. But the truck is much more interesting and much cooler. One, this immediately makes me think of the car levels from Sonic Adventure 2. I think that's what this was supposed to be riffing on. But actually, this comes from another game Lake was working on called XF Drive, which is going to be a racing game using these mechanics that I think he canceled, so he's probably like, hey, I don't want to throw away all that work on XF Drive. I'm putting it into Spark 3. Fortunately, though, that's not a problem, because this truck is actually really fun to use. You got drifting, boosting, whatever. It's pretty basic stuff, but it feels really good. It's very fast-paced. It's not that dissimilar from just running around a Spark. In fact, it's so similar that if you want, you can just not get in the truck and do these levels as Spark. And immediately I love that, because it brings to mind that constant thing of, like, why would Sonic be driving a car when he's faster than that on foot? And this game lets you say, yeah, why would I do that? And you don't get in the car, and you are faster as Spark. Thanks to the Lightspeed Dash and Magnet Dash being additive, you can just go faster and faster as you go through these levels. And it actually ends up having this vibe of the Mach Speed sections from Sonic 06, honestly. You know, these sections where you're going really, really, really fast, and there's not a whole lot of platforming here. It's just running forward and trying to steer and clear these courses as quickly as possible. Really ends up being similar, even down to looking for those trails to Lightspeed Dash off of to speed yourself up, just like you do in 06. But the thing that is especially impressive to me about this, and just this game in general, is that this isn't like the Mach Speed sections of 06, where that's like a special, dedicated, unique gameplay situation that the game puts you in, where the controls are different, the physics are different, and the game is different. This kind of ultra-high speed running down a track type of gameplay is the exact same gameplay that's used for the more traditional Sonic platforming levels. And that is also the exact same gameplay that's used for the shockingly in-depth character action combat. This game doesn't have all these different modes that it puts you in for different kinds of gameplay. This gameplay framework is just so robust and versatile that it can support really different types of gameplay without having to do anything, and that is insanely impressive to me. Need I remind you that this game was made by one guy? Though I do want to point out, I got a lot of comments in my Freedom Planet video talking about how I have always said that I don't want dedicated combat in Sonic. I don't feel that's right for Sonic. But then at the same time, you have games like Freedom Planet or Spark where they add dedicated combat to Sonic and it works amazingly. However, that does not change my feelings about combat in Sonic. Part of the reason that I'm okay with these games having combat is that they're not Sonic. They're Freedom Planet and Spark the Electric Jester. That allows them to do things that I feel would be inappropriate for Sonic and would deviate away too much from what the identity of Sonic is. These games have shown that yes, you can have amazing combat in a Sonic game, but I still wouldn't want Sonic to do that. That's what sets these games apart from Sonic. I don't want Sonic to just copy what other people are doing because it works, even games that are inspired by Sonic. I want the actual Sonic series itself to stay true to what it is. And you know, on that topic, I actually would say the same thing in reverse for Spark, because these games are obviously not shy about their influences. I mean, for fuck's sake, there is a Sonic mod for this game, and Lake Feperd himself made the model for it. He knows what he's doing. But still, I feel like Lake's games are a bit overly derivative of just the stuff that he likes. Like, obviously he's a big Sonic fan. Obviously he's a big Kirby fan and how that's influenced his games in many ways. And of course, as I said, big character action fan, Bayonetta, stuff like that, and all that comes through in his games, and that's all fine. You know, those are your influences, you're trying to make games similar to that and combine them together in new, cool, interesting ways. That's all great. But then when you have levels that are just straight up Rail Canyon from Sonic Heroes, and it looks exactly like it, and the music sounds very similar to that kind of music, the only thing I can think of is that this is discount Rail Canyon, legally distinct Rail Canyon, and it just makes me think of Sonic Heroes. You know what it doesn't make me think of? Spark the Electric Jester. And sometimes this does lead to really cool stuff, like this one level from Spark 2 where Lake was clearly like, hey, remember the intro to Sonic Unleashed? What if that was playable? And yeah, that's really sick, but again, I'm thinking about Sonic Unleashed and how cool that is. Despite the fact that these are not Sonic fan games, in many ways when I'm playing Spark, it does just feel like I'm playing a Sonic fan game, and I think that these games would be a bit stronger if they had a little bit more of their own unique identity, more originality in the ideas and the concepts and the environments and the level themes. You know, maybe don't make a character that is literally wearing the hat of another character from a game series you like. It's that kind of stuff that prevents me from being a fan of Spark the Electric Jester as a series. I love it as a game, but I could not give less of a shit about the character or the world, because it just feels like an amalgamation of things I like. Fortunately, at least in my case, like I said before, Lake and I seem to have pretty similar tastes, and this is an amalgamation of things I'm very into as well. So while I wish there was more originality here, doesn't take away from the fact that this game is insanely good. I went into Spark 3 with pretty high expectations based on what everyone has been saying about it since it came out, plus being a fan of Lake Feperd for so long, I was aware that he knew how to make awesome games. And even then, this game surprised me with how much fun it is. Much like what Freedom Planet 2 does for 2D Sonic gameplay, this game gives me something very close to what I've always wanted out of 3D Sonic gameplay. I don't have to look up at the stars anymore and wonder what 3D Sonic could be if they tried something different with it, because I have it now. I know what that is, and it's awesome. Also, I now am kicking myself for taking 2 years to getting around to playing these games, especially considering they both came out the same year as Sonic Frontiers, and I could have gotten both of them for the same amount of money. What kind of dumbass idiot Sonic fan am I to spend my time and money on Sonic Frontiers rather than these two games? Just goes to show you, don't follow the brand, kids. Follow the people that make cool things. Next up, Lake Feperd is making an F-Zero inspired sci-fi racing game, and I am certain it's going to be awesome. So you know I'm going to be picking that up when it comes out.